Northern Italy's Venetian lagoon is one of the most heavily romanticized destinations on Earth, famous for its grand architecture and winding canals. But resting directly between the tourist hubs of Venice and Lido is Poveglia. It is a forbidden zone. The Italian government has completely sealed the island off from the public, and visitors caught stepping foot on its shores face immediate arrest. Local fishermen refuse to navigate anywhere near the area. They chart wide paths around the island, and if their nets accidentally dredge up human remains from the shallow waters, they immediately dump the entire catch back into the sea to avoid bringing it to shore. Extreme local fear is driven by dark rumors. Ask around, and people will tell you the island's topsoil is 50. While the government cites structural safety for the lockdown, the island is essentially quarantined by its own history. Understanding this deep-seated fear requires looking back at the atrocities that birthed these legends. This diagram shows how little landmass we are dealing with. As the plague ravaged Europe, Venice used this tiny speck as an emergency quarantine zone. Ships unloaded the sick here to protect the main city, compacting roughly 160,000 infected corpses into massive, burning death pits. When gravediggers reopened these pits centuries later, they found what appeared to be a nightmare. Some older corpses had fresh blood dripping from their mouths. Believing these bodies were vampires feeding on other victims, diggers violently forced large bricks into the corpses' jaws to starve them. The reality behind these vampires is a lesson in post-mortem biology. When a human body decays inside a sealed dirt grave, decomposition gases rapidly expand inside the abdominal cavity. That extreme internal pressure eventually causes the organs to violently rupture. This forces residual blood and fluid straight up the esophagus and out the mouth. In their ignorance of basic biology, 16th century gravediggers weaponized their terror against rotting victims, mistaking the natural process of decay for the supernatural. For the victims abandoned on Poveglia, their final sight was often a figure wearing this grotesque, bird-like leather mask. At the time, physicians actually believed the plague was spread by a miasma, a thick, suffocating cloud of toxic air. They stuffed the long mask beaks with aromatic herbs and spices, believing floral scents would purify the air before reaching their lungs. We now know the plague is caused by a bacteria, usually transmitted through flea bites. The sweet-smelling herbs did absolutely nothing to stop an active bacterial infection. The iconic plague doctor mask remains a terrifying monument to medical ignorance in the face of an unstoppable biological killer. In 1922, the Italian government built this massive psychiatric asylum directly over the old plague pits, isolating new vulnerable patients from the mainland. The facility's director subjected these patients to horrific experiments. His preferred treatment was the lobotomy, a crude, irreversible brain surgery performed by driving a chisel above the patient's eye with a heavy hammer. Modern reports of supernatural encounters here match the facility's records. Witnesses describe a crying child, named Little Maria, or the sound of phantom wheelchairs racing through the wards, the specific demographics of the people who actually died in this building. The paranormal folklore of Poveglia is a geographical echo. Visitors project the island's documented history of trauma directly onto its ruins. The hospital has sat abandoned since 1968, rotting into a hollow shell. Urban explorers who illegally land on the island often crawl through old cremator ovens just to enter these decaying wards. As for the asylum's director, he eventually lost his own mind. Driven by guilt or the intense isolation of the island, he ended his life by plummeting from the facility's clock tower. Layer by layer, the soil of Poveglia absorbed centuries of misery, the desperate victims of the plague, the biological horror of the vampires, and the brutalized psychiatric patients. Poveglia Island remains strictly closed today as a massive, tragic mass grave. The horror documented here was generated by disease and human cruelty, providing a historical weight far more unsettling than any ghost story.